invasion of Ukraine? Is there a historical background to this occupation?
Well, this is a product of the transformation of nationalism in Russia during Vladimir Putin's rule of Russia since 2000, so for the last 23 years. What has happened is that Russian nationalism has changed from the time when it was in the Soviet Union to a kind of pre-Soviet Tsarist nationalism, which rejected the idea that Ukrainians existed as a people. Because prior to the Soviet Union, the Tsarist Empire said that there were just three branches of the Russian people: Great Russians, Little Russians, which are Ukrainians, Belarusians, which are White Russians. So this view of the Tsarist Empire and also of Russian emigres, Russian nationalist emigres, has been revived during Putin's presidency. And so this is very different from the Soviet period, because in the Soviet Union, of course, Ukraine was recognized as a separate people because it has a Soviet Republic. There were 15 Soviet republics. One of them was Ukrainian. Ukraine was also even a member of the United Nations because Stalin managed to get 3 places at the United Nations, one for the USSR, one for Belarus, one for Ukraine. So Ukrainians were recognized as different to Russians, but still very close, but different. Now the official position has gone to the pre-Soviet period, which is that there are no Ukrainian people. Ukrainian people are fake news. Ukrainians are a branch of the Russian people. In Russian, this is called Общерусский народ, so pan-Russian nation. And Ukrainians are little Russians. They're not Ukrainians. And this support for Ukrainian national identity is being done by the West, by the Americans, by the Europeans, to weaken Russia as a great power, because Russia always believes that it will be a great power only if it controls Ukraine, because Ukraine was the second biggest republic of the Soviet Union, very big industrial base, a lot of agriculture, so kind of quite powerful industrially and militarily. And so Russia believes it can only control this whole region of the former USSR if it controls Ukraine. And so the reason that Putin launched this invasion was, you can say, genocide. It was a genocidal goal of destroying Ukrainian national identity, of making Ukraine look like Belarus. So Belarus under Lukashenko, who has been ruling Belarus since 1994, he has kind of created this Soviet pro-Russian region. And they wanted to do the same in Ukraine, to remove President Zelensky, install a puppet, pro-Russian puppet, and then destroy Ukrainian identity, and then make it into a kind of a pro-Russian, little Russian satellite country or colony of Russia. This was the mistake. Putin is a dictator. Russia is a dictatorship. So Putin was told bad information, which he wanted to believe, that these Ukrainians were suffering under Zelensky, and they would welcome the Russian army as liberators. Of course, this was fake news. This was not going to happen, but this is what they believed. And so the invasion was a big, big mistake. They never expected the resistance. They expected, Ukrainians to go, yes, hooray, and so they never expected armed resistance, this very patriotic resistance. They expected the Ukrainians to go, yes, fantastic, we are being liberated by our Russian brothers. And so the invasion was a mistake based on false historical myths of Ukraine, that Ukrainians don't exist, there is no Ukrainian identity, that these are little Russians who want to live next door to be part of Russia. This was the big mistake, and it has cost Russia a lot in terms of sanctions, in terms of number of over 300,000 military casualties, because they never understood that Ukrainian identity is very strong, and that this was even strong in the Soviet Union, never mind since 1991. So the mistake was to assume that Ukrainians would be very happy to go back to Russia.
What is the logic of the imperialist policy pursued by Russia?
Well, this is one of the most interesting aspects of this, is that Russia pretends to the third world, to the developing world countries, to the global south. It pretends it is an anti-colonial country. This, of course, is complete fake news, because Russian Empire was one of the most brutal colonial empires in the world, destroyed many indigenous peoples in the Caucasus, in Crimea, in Siberia, in the Far East, and it continues to repress those non-Russian minorities. There is the reason many of those non-Russian minorities in the Russian Federation are deliberately sent to die in Ukraine to fight in the war. They are sent in greater numbers than Russian people. So the Russian Empire was always a brutal colonial empire, and we saw this in World War II when Stalin ethnically cleansed Meskhetian Turks and Crimean Tatars, and this was a genocide for Crimean Tatars. So when Russia pretends it is anti-colonial and anti-imperialist, this is completely not true. And so the history of Russia as a colonial empire is very long. And in the case of Ukraine, it has been very brutal. Of course, the problem that you have is that when Crimean Tatars, when Ukrainians, when other peoples write about their true history of what they have suffered under Russia, the Russian nationalists do not like this, because they want to always say, no, you lived very good under Russia. You lived very well, very nicely. Of course, this is not true. So Russian leaders always complained about school textbooks in Ukraine, about history books, because they wrote very negatively about the Russian Empire. The Russian Empire there was no serfdom in Ukraine, because the Cossack was a free democratic republic, the Cossacks. But the Russian Empire introduced serfdom. Russian Empire banned the use of the Ukrainian language twice in the 19th century. And so all of these negative aspects, plus the negative aspects of Soviet life, Russification, genocide, cultural destruction, the Ukrainian famine, Holodomor of 1933, which killed 4 to 5 million people. All of this has been written about by Ukrainian historians since the collapse of the Soviet Union. But of course, Russian nationalists do not like this, because they want to write about how everything was wonderful. And Russian nationalists continue to lie about Crimean Tatars. They continue to say, no, Stalin was correct to deport them because they collaborated with the Nazis. This, of course, this is not true. But Russian nationalists continue to say this because Stalin has been made into a cult hero in Putin's Russia. In Putin's Russia, the so-called Great Patriotic War is a religious cult, and Putin has rehabilitated and made Stalin into a hero. So they cannot criticize things what Stalin did, such as murdering millions of people and committing genocide against Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars.
Russia followed policies that would cause problems in many places, Georgia, Azerbaijan, or Kazakhstan. In many places, this policy began to collapse. What do you think that problem?
Well, it's because already before the invasion, Russia was a declining power. The difference between Russia and China is that China is a rising power. It is a growing power, whereas Russia was already a declining power. I mean, for example, the only exports Russia had was oil, gas, and military equipment, nothing else. So no modern equipment, no modern technology. China is very different in this sense. And so Russia as a declining power has now become faster. The collapse of Russia as a great power is going even more. And the war in Ukraine has really destroyed the Russian army. It is very, very weak now. Because of all of these factors, the destruction of Russian military equipment, the 300,000 Russian military casualties, all of this has made Russia feel very weak in Eurasia, in the former Soviet Union. And countries like Kazakhstan, like Azerbaijan, and Armenia even now, they are using this opportunity to become free of Russian domination. So we saw this with Azerbaijan when it launched its last campaign to liberate its territory in Karabakh, and Russia did not intervene. Russia's too weak now. Its troops, its military is too weak. And we also see this in Central Asia, where they are now more closely aligning to China than to Russia, and you can see that when there is meetings of China, Russia, and Central Asia, that Russia is a younger brother of China now. Because China is a big power. It's rising. It's got more population, more bigger economy. Russia is a very, very declining. I mean, just by the fact that of Russia's main exports, it has lost the European market for oil and gas. And that was 40% of Russia's government budget came from the sale of oil and gas to Europe. That's gone. And it will not come back now, because Europe has now become independent of Russian energy. And secondly, Russian military equipment has been shown to be very, very poor in Ukraine. Russian military equipment is very poor quality. So many countries are no longer going to buy Russian military equipment. And if you have Russian military equipment like India, you need to change very quickly because it's not very good. So I think Russia, this decline of Russia will continue, and the countries around there are using this opportunity to become more independent of Russia, more free. Armenia is now trying to do this because Prime Minister Pashinyan could see that Russia was not really helping Armenia against Azerbaijan. So Armenia is trying to now integrate with Europe, away from Russia. It will be very difficult because Armenia is a member of all the Russian-led organizations in Eurasia, like Eurasian Economic Union and military structures. But Pashinyan wants to, I think, break away from Russia. So the war in Ukraine has led to the collapse of Russia as the big imperial power in Eurasia.
Actually, I think Russia rejects many identity post-Soviet area, but nowadays many countries have a decolonization process.
Mm-hmm.
How has Russian colonialism been maintained throughout history? Is this situation related to Russian nationalism?
Yes, of course, it's related to Russian nationalism, but also Russian identity. In the Soviet Union and in the Russian Federation, Russian people were always told that they were good guys, that they were the good people, that they brought civilization to the non-Russian people, that they helped them, that they were always nice to them, that they kind of provided them with modernity, industrialization, urbanization, culture. Of course, this was not true. Of course, this was a typical discourse and rhetoric of all colonial powers. The British and the French also said, we brought you civilization, we brought you culture. You were all very backward people until we came. So this is typical language of imperialist colonial powers. So Russia in this sense is typical. It's not unusual in saying this. But the difference is that Russian as a country has never been self-critical of its historic past. It's always believed that its historic past was great, that it had nothing to criticize, that the Soviet Union, the Tsarist Empire was always very beneficial for everybody. And because of this, they cannot be critical. They do not like criticism of their history. And therefore they find it very not very good when countries like Ukraine, but now also Kazakhstan, they are opening up Soviet archives. Russia wants to keep those archives closed because those archives talk a lot about crimes of the Soviet Union, for example, about deportations. Before, in the 1920s and 30s, many millions of Kazakhs died also from Soviet policies. So when you open up these archives, you reveal the true nature of Russian imperialism and colonialism. And also things like monuments. Russia and the Soviet Union always built lots of monuments to Russian poets, writers, to military leaders. And this was a way to say, this territory belongs to me because my monuments are here, my street names are named after Russian leaders. So all of this kind of thing is a way to lay claim to those territories, that you belong in my sphere of influence, in my empire. When countries like Ukraine begin to change those street names, they begin to pull down monuments. So, for example, in Odessa, Ukraine has taken down the monument to Catherine, the empire, the imperial leader, Catherine the Great, because she was an imperialist. She ethnically cleansed Crimean Tatars for the first time in 1783, when many of them went to Ottoman Turkey then. So these changes, which are being undertaken by Ukrainians, by Kazakhs, by Georgians and others, are something that Russian nationalists hate. They don't like this because they are seeing that these countries are revealing the true nature of Russian colonialism and imperialism.
I have one question. It's not type of history or politics, but it's, I think, good question. What kind of an end awaits Russia in the war that ended with Ukraine's victory?
I think it's a very good question because when Ukraine will defeat Russia militarily, this will be a big catastrophe for Russia because Russians will have to deal with the consequences of, for example, Ukrainians and Russians will hate each other for decades. For decades. The war crimes committed by the Russian army, the Russian government in Ukraine will make Ukrainians hate them for many, many years. So this war has led to the complete divorce of Ukrainians and Russians. Putin wanted to have this invasion to bring the Ukrainians back to Russia, and he's done the opposite. He's pushed Ukrainians away. Also, many other countries are also distancing, making themselves separate to Russia. So, for example, no countries around Russia support Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The only country to do this is Belarus. At the United Nations, even pro-Russian countries like Kazakhstan, Armenia, have not supported Russia at the United Nations. They have always abstained. They have never supported Russia in votes. So Russia has lost the support of all its neighbors. And also, finally, the two big, I think, factors which will happen will be that Russians will have to deal with the traumatic experience of what they did to other people. The collapse of Russia in this war will force them to be more self-critical of their historic past. And I think the big danger is that Russia can either completely disintegrate, with the non-Russian regions becoming independent, like in the Far East, in Siberia, in the Caucasus, or Russia will go back to the 1990s, where it was a very weak, very poorly organized, dysfunctional state, where different regions did not listen to Moscow, for example. And so I think either of these possibilities are there. There's a growing anger in the non-Russian regions of the Russian Federation that they are being used as miaso, as meat, as cannon fodder in this war. They are being killed in higher numbers than the Russian people, because Putin is deliberately sending Buryats, Kalmyks, and other non-minority peoples to fight in Ukraine, so that they are killed there. So there are a lot of anger there. For example, many Dagestanis killed in Ukraine, and Buryats and Kalmyks, Tatars from the Tatarstan, and so that anger will become even greater. And we can see that the Putin's regime is very weak. When Prigozhin, the leader of Wagner Group, organized a military coup, when he organized this military coup, the Russian security forces, Siloviki, were hiding. They were afraid of Prigozhin. Putin was a coward. He fled from Moscow. He ran away from Moscow. So this regime looks very strong, but it actually is very weak. And so I think that that if there is the next big kind of military defeats on the battlefield by Ukraine could create big problems, especially because Putin has Russian elections in March of next year. And if there is a big Ukrainian victory before March, this will create major problems for Russian elections. So I think Russia is in a very dangerous situation now. And any change in Russia will never be peaceful. It will always be violent.
Thank you. Thank you for talking to us. You answered all our questions patiently.
Thank you again for inviting me, and let us work together for the victory of Ukrainian and Crimean Tatar people.